Well, hello and welcome again to our series of Bible studies looking through Luke's Gospel. Today we've reached Luke chapter 6 and verses 12 to 16. So I'm going to read those verses. You may want to follow along if you have a Bible at home. So Luke 6, verses 12 to 16. One of those days, Jesus went out to a mountainside to pray and spent the night praying to God. When morning came, he called his disciples to him and chose 12 of them, whom he also designated apostles: Simon, whom he named Peter, his brother Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot, Judas, son of James, and Judas Iscariot, who became a traitor. So just going to consider these words together and see if we can understand them a little bit more deeply than they first appear. We have to remember that following Jesus around, there was a large crowd of people, and there was a closer group called the disciples. Disciples comes from the word for follower or student, and usually the pattern back in those days for a disciple was to approach a rabbi and say, please, can I follow you? Please, can I come to understand your teachings? And remember, Jesus's pattern tended to be different. He tended to call people, you come and follow me, rather than them coming to him. But within the disciples themselves, there was a smaller group, the apostles. And within the apostles themselves, there was three of them, Peter, James, and John, that seem to have an even more closer group to Jesus. So you've got these groups. You've got the crowd, the disciples, the apostles, and then you've got Peter, James, and John. So if you remember, in terms of the disciples, we're told, for example, once that Jesus sends 70 odd of his disciples out on a mission trip. Also in Acts, the early chapters of Acts, we're told there are 120 of his disciples praying in the upper room. And so this was a large group, but the apostles were 12 particularly chosen. And we see here the process by which Jesus goes to choose his apostles. Well, first of all, there's the prayer on a mountain. So he spent the whole night praying to God about this decision. And interestingly, through the Gospel of Luke, at key points when decisions are being made, Jesus is always at prayer. And so an example for us when we face key decisions is to be praying for them. But we can learn quite a lot from this very short passage, these few verses here, about his apostles. The word apostle means someone, one who is sent. Now, Jesus himself was one who was sent from God the Father, sent to reveal God to human beings. And now the apostles themselves are going to be sent by Jesus. Initially, in Luke's Gospel, they're sent on short-term mission trips. Then obviously later, the book of Acts, which is Luke really part 2, they're sent to take the gospel to the four corners of the earth. So that is going to be their mission. And so Jesus chooses these 12. Now, because we know the names of the apostles before, we're not really surprised by the names that are chosen. We're just so used to the list. But imagine the alternative 12 apostles for a moment. Here's an alternative list of 12. Lazarus, Bartimaeus, Jairus, Zacchaeus, the rich young ruler, John the Baptist, Joseph of Arimathea, Nicodemus, a couple of centurions for security, and Martha and Mary. There you'd have, good treasurer, financial backing. You'd have a theologian. You'd have good security, a balanced group, if you like. But Jesus' choice is perhaps different to ours. And so Jesus chooses people we wouldn't necessarily expect. So to take a couple of the names from the list, for example, obviously there's Judas Iscariot, who's the treasurer who came to betray him. And then you've got two very contrasting characters. Matthew, I've talked about in a previous study, who was a tax collector, who would have been seen as a Roman collaborator. And then almost the opposite of Matthew, you've got Simon, who is called the Zealot. Now, the Zealots were kind of the terrorists, really, of the day, and they so hated the Roman occupation. Often, Zealots would be those that would attack or even assassinate Roman soldiers. So you've got two different sides of the political situation there. You've got pro-Roman and an anti-Roman in Jesus's group of disciples. So it shows how Jesus' choices supersede and overrule perhaps the disputes of the world. So within the church, we should see perhaps people with different political opinions, but always that unity should be there for Christians as brothers and sisters in Christ. And you see the unity amongst the apostles, and they had a shared mission, a shared cause, and obviously a shared faith in Jesus Christ. And so you've got amongst the apostles, you've got the terrorist, the tax collector, and the traitor, if you like, the three T's, which is an interesting group of people for Jesus to look after. And we're told here that he chose 12 of them. Now, 12 is significant in the Bible. What other 12s are there? Well, there's the 12 tribes of Israel from the Old Testament. And 12 is really a symbol of completion, perfection. And so to have 12 is a sign of the complete number, if you like, but also symbolically the same number as the tribes of Israel in the Old Testament. So kind of saying, well, Jesus here is creating a new Israel, a new people of God here. The 12 tribes, obviously named after Jacob's 12 sons. And now you've got a new 12. And specifically, the 12 are given this mission to take the gospel, as I say, in the book of Acts, to the rest of the world. So the foundation of the new Israel, the church, if you like, is to be these 12. And we know it's the foundation because Paul writes in his letter to the Ephesians about how the church is built on the foundation of the apostles and the prophets. So you don't, once you've got a building, you don't again build on the foundations. It's based on the foundations. And so these days, we wouldn't expect anyone to have the title apostle because that would be someone specially chosen by Jesus in person. We know that Paul was an unusual exception to this rule, and Paul obviously was someone who was chosen to encounter Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, on a Damascus road, and calls himself one who is unnaturally called. And then you've got the replacement apostle after Jesus' death in the beginning of the book of Acts. You've got Matthias, who's appointed, but again, he's appointed on the basis of having been with Jesus for 3 years. Obviously, he's been one of the disciples at this point, and then called to be an apostle to replace Judas, who obviously meets a sticky end, as we may get to later on in Luke's gospel. So the apostles were foundational. So we shouldn't expect to see apostles around today. So people who call themselves apostle, they can call themselves one who's sent, but not specifically Jesus' apostles, because these were 12 specially chosen people for this mission. And the mission is to take the gospel to the ends of the earth. They're going to spend time specifically with Jesus. They're going to be have the privilege of hearing Jesus' teaching, but also the explanation of his parables. The secrets of the kingdom are given to the apostles. But with many privileges comes great responsibility as well. So, yes, they're given these special privileges, but also they're called, eventually, most of them, 11 out of the 12, laid down their lives in the history of the church for the gospel. Only the Apostle John seems to sort of die of natural causes in old age. The rest of the apostles are martyrs, lose their life in the history of the early church. And so what comes with the privileges of being an apostle comes responsibility, and also the sacrifice that comes with it is to serve Jesus until the end. So people should not call themselves apostles these days. It's not a right title to actually use for somebody. And we should be grateful to these 12 people because we know that they were not superheroes. They had their particular sins. We know especially about Peter's sins, about denying Jesus. They were sinful human beings, yet God used them for a great and noble task. And so God can use us. We're not apostles today, but we can do the same job as the apostles. We can be ambassadors for God in whatever context we might find ourselves, in our workplace, in our families, in our neighborhoods, in our social context, in our sports context, in all those places. We're ambassadors for God, and our mission is to take the gospel, to live the good news, and to speak the good news of Jesus Christ to those who have not yet heard the message. So we can follow in the tradition of the apostles today by taking the message to those that have not yet heard the message of Jesus.